My name is Harper White. I'm 28 years old, and this is the story of how I was headed to my lawyer's office to discuss my father's fortune when I received the most unexpected call that changed everything. You know that feeling when you think you have your life figured out? When you believe you know exactly who you can trust? Well, I'm about to share with you the most shocking betrayal that completely shattered everything I thought I knew about my own family. Have you ever had that moment when a single phone call turned your entire world upside down? If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you loved, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up because you're going to relate to every single word I'm about to tell you. Let me know in the comments if you've ever been in a situation where trust was broken in the most unexpected way. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and I remember feeling unusually optimistic about my future. My father, Robert White, had passed away 6 months earlier after a long battle with cancer, and I was finally ready to sit down with his lawyer, Mr. Davidson, to discuss the inheritance he had left behind. Dad had always been secretive about his finances, but he had promised me that I would be taken care of, that everything he had worked for would eventually be mine. I had spent weeks preparing for this meeting, organizing documents and trying to understand the legal aspects of inheriting his estate. The sun was shining that day, and I felt like I was about to step into a new chapter of my life, one where financial stability would finally give me the freedom to pursue my dreams. As I walked toward the law office on 5th Street, I couldn't help but think about all the conversations Dad and I had shared about the future. He used to tell me stories about how he built his construction business from nothing, how every brick he laid was an investment in my future. "Harper," he would say, "I'm working this hard so you never have to worry about money the way I did when I was young." Those words had always given me comfort, especially during the difficult months of his illness when medical bills were piling up. I trusted that his love for me was genuine, and that everything he had promised would come to pass. The memory of his warm smile and his reassuring voice made me walk a little faster toward what I believed would be a life-changing meeting. I had my phone in my hand, checking the time to make sure I wouldn't be late for the 10 a.m. appointment, when it started ringing. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it anyway. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was just curiosity. Looking back now, I wish I had let that call go to voicemail, because what I was about to hear would destroy every assumption I had about my family and my future. But in that moment, standing just 2 blocks away from the lawyer's office, I pressed the green button and said hello. Little did I know that this single decision would lead me down a path of discovery that would reveal the darkest secrets my family had been hiding from me for years. The voice on the other end belonged to someone who claimed to know my father very well. Someone who said they had urgent information about his estate that I needed to hear before I met with the lawyer. My heart started racing as this stranger began to speak, their words cutting through the morning air like a knife through my chest. They told me to sit down, that what they were about to reveal would shock me beyond belief. As I found myself gripping a nearby bench for support, I had no idea that the next few minutes would completely change my understanding of who my father really was. But that's when things took a turn I never saw coming, and the perfect morning I had imagined was about to become the beginning of the most challenging period of my life. The stranger on the phone introduced herself as Linda Morrison, and she claimed to be my father's business partner, a business partner I had never heard of in my entire life. "Harper," she said in a voice that was both urgent and sympathetic, "your father and I worked together for 15 years, and there are things about his estate that you need to know before you walk into that lawyer's office." My mind immediately started racing with questions because Dad had never mentioned having a business partner, especially not a woman named Linda. I had always believed he ran his construction company alone, that he was the sole owner and decision-maker of everything he had built. If you've ever received shocking news that made you question everything you thought you knew, please hit subscribe and like this video, because I know you'll understand the confusion I was feeling in that moment. Have you ever had someone call you with information that completely contradicted what your family had told you? Linda's voice was steady, but filled with an emotion I couldn't quite identify, as she continued to speak. "Your father didn't just own a construction business, Harper. We were partners in several investments, real estate deals, and other ventures that generated significant income over the years." She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath before continuing. But 6 months before he passed away, he made some decisions that affected both of our families. And I think you deserve to know the truth before you sign any documents. My hands were shaking as I held the phone, and I had to sit down on the bench because my legs suddenly felt weak. The confidence I had felt just moments before was quickly being replaced by a growing sense of dread and uncertainty. She began to explain that my father had been living a double life, one that involved financial partnerships and agreements that he had kept hidden from our family for years. Robert was a good man, but he made some choices in his final months that weren't entirely honest, Linda said, her voice becoming more serious. According to her, Dad had transferred significant assets to other accounts without telling me, essentially moving money that should have been part of his estate into places where I would never find it. She claimed that he had been worried about taxes and legal complications, so he had moved funds to protect them, but in doing so, he had also hidden them from me. The more she talked, the more I realized that the father I thought I knew, the honest, hard-working man who always taught me about integrity, might have been someone completely different. I felt like I was listening to a story about a stranger, not the man who had raised me and promised to take care of my future. Linda then dropped the biggest bombshell of all. Harper, your father wasn't just protecting money from taxes. He was hiding assets because he had debts and obligations that he never told you about. My heart sank as she explained that Dad had borrowed money against his business, using the construction company as collateral for loans that I knew nothing about. She said that these debts were significant enough to potentially wipe out most of the inheritance I was expecting to receive. The lawyer you're about to meet has been instructed to present you with a version of the estate that doesn't include these complications, she continued. But I couldn't let you walk into that meeting without knowing the full truth about what your father left behind. I felt like the ground was disappearing beneath my feet as I tried to process this information. As Linda finished explaining the situation, she made one final revelation that completely shattered my world. Harper, I'm not just calling you as Robert's business partner. I'm calling you because I was also his partner in life for the past 8 years. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I actually gasped out loud right there on the street. She explained that while my father had never divorced my mother, who had passed away when I was 16, he had been in a committed relationship with Linda for nearly a decade. We lived together. We shared everything, and he promised me that I would be taken care of when he passed away, she said, her voice now filled with emotion. But it seems like he made promises to both of us that he couldn't keep. I was completely speechless, staring at the lawyer's office building in front of me while trying to comprehend that everything I thought I knew about my father's life after Mom's death had been a lie. But this was only the beginning of the shocking revelations that would completely change my understanding of my family forever. After Linda hung up the phone, I just sat there on that bench for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. My mind was completely blank, like someone had just erased everything I thought I knew about my life and replaced it with static noise. I kept replaying her words over and over again, trying to make sense of what she had just told me about my father having a secret life, secret debts, and a secret relationship that lasted 8 years. How could someone I lived with, someone who raised me and taught me about honesty, keep such massive secrets from me for so long? If you've ever felt like your entire reality was suddenly turned upside down by shocking news, please subscribe and like this video, because I know you understand that feeling of complete disorientation. Have you ever had a moment where you questioned everything you believed about someone you loved? My first instinct was complete denial. There was absolutely no way that Linda Morrison was telling me the truth about my father. Dad was the most honest man I had ever known, the kind of person who would drive back to a store if they gave him too much change, who always taught me that integrity was more important than money. The idea that he had been living with another woman while keeping it secret from me seemed impossible, like something out of a movie rather than real life. I told myself that this Linda person was probably just a scammer trying to take advantage of my grief, someone who had read Dad's obituary and was now attempting to confuse me before I received my inheritance. There had to be a logical explanation for everything she had said, and I was determined to prove that she was lying. I pulled out my phone and started going through my father's contacts, looking for any trace of Linda Morrison's name or number. I scrolled through years of text messages, emails, and call logs, searching for any evidence that this woman had ever been part of his life. But as I searched, I started noticing things that I had never paid attention to before, like how Dad always seemed to have somewhere to go on weekends, or how he never invited me to his house after Mom died, always preferring to meet me at restaurants or come to my apartment instead. I remembered how he would sometimes seem distracted during our conversations, checking his phone frequently or making excuses to leave early. At the time, I had attributed these behaviors to grief over losing Mom, but now I was starting to wonder if there had been another explanation all along. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there were so many gaps in my knowledge of Dad's daily life after Mom passed away. He had sold our family home within a year of her death, claiming it was too painful to live there, but he had never invited me to see his new place. Whenever I asked about visiting, he would say he was still getting settled or that the place was too messy for guests. Now I was wondering if the real reason was that Linda Morrison was living there with him, and he couldn't risk me discovering their relationship. I felt sick to my stomach as I considered the possibility that every time he had canceled plans with me or seemed distracted during our conversations, he might have been prioritizing his secret life over our relationship. The father who had always taught me that family comes first might have been putting someone else ahead of me for 8 entire years. But even with all these doubts creeping into my mind, I still couldn't fully accept what Linda had told me. I kept telling myself that there had to be another explanation, that my father couldn't possibly have been the kind of person who would lie to me about something so important. I decided that the only way to know for sure was to go ahead with my meeting with the lawyer and see if anything Linda had said would be confirmed or contradicted by the official documents. Standing up from the bench, I brushed off my jacket and started walking toward Mr. Davidson's office again, trying to convince myself that everything would make sense once I saw the real estate papers. I told myself that Linda Morrison was probably just a confused woman who had somehow gotten mixed up in my father's business affairs, and that the lawyer would clear everything up. Little did I know that what I was about to discover in that office would confirm Linda's story in ways I never could have imagined, and that my denial was about to be shattered by cold, hard legal documents that would prove my father had been living a double life. When I walked into Mr. Davidson's law office, I was still clinging to the hope that Linda Morrison had been lying about everything. Mr. Davidson was an older man with kind eyes who had known my father for over 20 years, and I trusted him to give me the honest truth about Dad's estate. He welcomed me into his office with a warm smile and offered me coffee, but I could see something in his expression that made me nervous, like he was preparing to deliver news that he knew would be difficult for me to hear. As he opened the thick folder containing my father's documents, I held my breath and prepared myself for what I hoped would be good news. If you've ever walked into a situation knowing that your life might be about to change forever, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, because I know you understand that feeling of anticipation mixed with dread. Have you ever had a moment where you knew you were about to learn something that would change everything? Mr. Davidson cleared his throat and began explaining my father's estate in a way that immediately confirmed my worst fears about Linda's phone call. "Harper, I need to be completely honest with you about your father's financial situation," he said, his voice gentle but serious. He explained that Dad's construction business had been struggling for the past few years, and that he had taken out several loans using the business and his personal assets as collateral. "Your father was a proud man who didn't want to burden you with his financial troubles, especially while he was battling cancer," Mr. Davidson continued. "The numbers he showed me were staggering. Dad owed more than $300,000 to various creditors, which meant that most of his assets would need to be sold to pay off these debts. My heart sank as I realized that the comfortable inheritance I had been counting on was actually a pile of financial obligations that I never knew existed. But the worst revelation was yet to come, and it involved Linda Morrison in ways that made my stomach turn. Mr. Davidson pulled out another set of documents and explained that my father had legally designated Linda as the beneficiary of his life insurance policy, which was worth $250,000. "He changed this designation about 3 years ago," the lawyer said, watching my face carefully as the implications of this decision sank in. Not only had Dad been living with Linda in secret, but he had also made sure that she would receive the largest single payout from his estate. Meanwhile, I was left with a house that was mortgaged beyond its value, and business debts that would take years to resolve. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach as I realized that my father had essentially chosen Linda over me when it came to financial security after his death. Mr. Davidson then showed me documents that revealed the full extent of my father's deception, including a will that had been updated just 6 months before his death. In this will, Dad had left me his personal belongings and what remained of his business after all debts were paid. But he had created a separate trust fund that would provide Linda with monthly payments for the next 10 years. Your father wanted to make sure that Linda would be taken care of, Mr. Davidson explained. But he also wanted you to inherit the family legacy, even if it came with financial challenges. I stared at the papers in disbelief, trying to understand how the man who had raised me to value honesty above all else could have orchestrated such an elaborate deception. The signatures on these documents were definitely his, and the dates proved that he had been planning this distribution of assets while he was still healthy enough to make clear decisions. As I sat in that lawyer's office, surrounded by evidence of my father's secret life, I finally had to accept that Linda Morrison had been telling me the truth about everything. Dad had indeed been living a double life, maintaining a relationship with Linda while keeping me completely in the dark about their partnership both in business and in love. He had made financial decisions that prioritized her security over mine, and he had done it all while looking me in the eye and promising that I would be taken care of after he was gone. The man I had idolized, the father who had taught me that family always comes first, had actually put someone else's needs ahead of his own daughter's future. I felt a mixture of grief, anger, and betrayal that was so intense I could barely breathe, and I knew that I would never be able to think of my father the same way again. But this discovery was just the beginning of a journey that would force me to confront not only my father's deception, but also my own assumptions about trust, family, and what it really means to be betrayed by someone you love more than life itself. Sitting in my car outside the lawyer's office, I couldn't stop thinking about all the family moments that now felt like lies. I kept remembering the last Christmas we spent together, when Dad had given me a beautiful necklace and told me how much he loved me, how proud he was to be my father. At the time, I had felt so grateful to have such a caring dad, but now I wondered if Linda had been waiting at home for him, if he had bought her a gift too, maybe even a more expensive one. Every hug, every "I love you," every promise about taking care of me, they all felt tainted now by the knowledge that he was living a completely different life with someone else. If you've ever had to re-examine precious family memories after learning something that changed everything, please subscribe and like this video, because I know you understand how painful it is to question moments that once brought you joy. Have you ever felt like your entire childhood was built on secrets and lies? I started thinking about all the times Dad had canceled plans with me, claiming he was too tired from work or needed to handle business matters. Now I realized that business matters probably meant spending time with Linda, going on dates, building a relationship that I was never supposed to know about. I remembered feeling hurt when he missed my college graduation party, when he couldn't make it to my birthday dinner, when he always seemed to have somewhere else to be on holidays. I had attributed his absence to grief over Mom's death, thinking he was struggling to cope with family gatherings without her. But the truth was that he had created a new family with Linda, one that apparently took priority over the daughter who had always believed she was the most important person in his world. The memories that hurt the most were the conversations we had about Mom and how much he missed her. Dad used to tell me stories about their love story, about how she was the only woman he could ever imagine spending his life with, about how her death had left him empty and alone. I had felt so sorry for him, thinking he was living a lonely life while trying to be strong for me. Now I knew that while he was telling me these romantic stories about Mom, he was actually sharing his bed with Linda Morrison, building new memories with her that replaced the ones he had shared with my mother. It felt like he had not only betrayed me, but he had also dishonored Mom's memory by pretending to be the grieving widower while secretly moving on with someone else. I thought about all the advice Dad had given me about relationships, about how important it was to be honest with the people you love, about how trust was the foundation of any meaningful connection. "Harper," he used to say, "never lie to someone you care about, because once trust is broken, it's almost impossible to rebuild." These words had shaped how I approached my own relationships, how I had always prioritized honesty even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. Now I realized that my father had been giving me advice that he himself wasn't following, teaching me values that he was actively violating in his own life. The man who had been my moral compass, my example of integrity and character, had actually been living as a hypocrite for years. As I sat there trying to process all of these painful realizations, I felt a deep sense of grief that went beyond just losing my father to cancer. I was mourning the loss of the father I thought I had, the man I had admired and respected and tried to emulate in my own life, the Robert White who had raised me, who had taught me right from wrong, who had promised to always be honest with me. That person had never really existed. Instead, I had been living with an illusion, a carefully constructed version of my father that had been designed to hide his true priorities and commitments. I felt like I was attending a second funeral, this time for the father I had believed in, and this grief was somehow even more devastating than the one I had experienced when he actually died. But I knew that before I could move forward, I would have to decide what to do with this terrible knowledge, and whether I had the strength to confront the people who had been part of this deception. In the days following my meeting with Mr. Davidson, I found myself completely paralyzed by an impossible decision. Should I confront Linda Morrison about her relationship with my father, or should I just accept the situation and try to move on with my life? Part of me wanted to call her immediately and demand answers to all the questions that were keeping me awake at night, while another part of me wondered if learning more details would only make the pain worse. I kept thinking about what my father would have wanted me to do, but then I realized that I had no idea what kind of person he really was, or what his true wishes might have been. If you've ever been in a situation where you had to choose between seeking the truth and protecting your own peace of mind, please subscribe and hit that like button because I know you understand how difficult these kinds of decisions can be. Have you ever discovered something about a family member that made you question whether you really wanted to know the whole story? The practical side of me kept saying that I should just let it go and focus on rebuilding my life without the inheritance I had been expecting. After all, Dad was gone. Linda was dealing with her own grief, and digging deeper into their relationship wouldn't change the financial reality I was now facing. Maybe the healthiest thing would be to accept that my father had made his choices, honor the good memories I had with him, and start fresh without getting caught up in the complicated emotions surrounding his secret life. I tried to convince myself that knowing more about Linda and their relationship wouldn't help me pay off the debts he had left behind, or change the fact that I would need to find a new way to support myself financially. Sometimes ignorance really can be bliss, and maybe this was one of those situations where the truth would only cause more suffering. But there was another voice in my head that was much louder and more insistent, the voice that demanded justice and honesty even if it was painful. This voice kept reminding me that Linda Morrison had received a $250,000 life insurance payout, while I was left with nothing but debts and broken promises. It wasn't fair that she got to benefit from my father's love and financial support, while I, his actual daughter, was struggling to understand how I would pay for his funeral expenses and handle his business obligations. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became about the fact that this woman had essentially stolen 8 years of my father's attention and resources, time that should have been spent strengthening his relationship with me, instead of building a secret life that excluded his only child. I started to realize that my decision wasn't just about money or inheritance, it was about my own self-respect and my need to understand who my father really was. If I just walked away without confronting Linda, I would spend the rest of my life wondering about the details of their relationship, about whether Dad had ever really loved me as much as he claimed, about what other secrets might be hidden in the life he had shared with her. I would always feel like a fool, like the naive daughter who was too trusting to see what was happening right under her nose. The thought of living with that kind of uncertainty and self-doubt felt worse than whatever pain might come from learning the complete truth about my father's double life. After a week of sleepless nights and constant internal debate, I finally made my decision. I was going to confront Linda Morrison and demand that she tell me everything about her relationship with my father. I needed to know how long they had been planning their life together, whether Dad had ever mentioned me to her, and what promises he had made to both of us that he clearly couldn't keep. More importantly, I needed to look her in the eye and tell her how her presence in my father's life had affected me, how her secret relationship had stolen precious time and attention that should have been mine. I wasn't going to let fear or politeness stop me from getting the answers I deserved, even if those answers were painful or disappointing. The time for protecting everyone else's feelings was over. Now it was time to protect my own need for truth and closure, no matter what the consequences might be. But as I picked up my phone to call Linda and arrange a meeting, I had no idea that what she would tell me would be even more shocking than everything I had already discovered. When I finally worked up the courage to call Linda Morrison and asked to meet her in person, I realized that this decision would affect much more than just my understanding of my father's secret life. This wasn't just about getting answers to my questions. It was about deciding what kind of person I wanted to be going forward, whether I would be someone who accepts being lied to or someone who fights for the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. I knew that once I sat down face to face with the woman who had shared my father's life for 8 years, there would be no going back to the innocent version of myself who believed Dad was a grieving widower living alone. If you've ever had to make a choice that you knew would change you as a person, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button, because what I'm about to share will show you exactly what happens when you decide to fight for your own dignity. Have you ever reached a point where you realized that staying silent would mean losing respect for yourself? The more I thought about what was at stake, the more I realized that this confrontation was about much more than money or inheritance. It was about my identity as Robert White's daughter. For my entire life, I had defined myself as the child of a man who valued honesty, integrity, and family above all else. Someone who had taught me to always tell the truth, even when it was difficult. If I just accepted that he had been living a lie for 8 years without ever demanding an explanation, what would that say about the values he had supposedly instilled in me? I couldn't bear the thought of becoming the kind of person who just rolls over and accepts betrayal, who lets other people walk all over them because confrontation is uncomfortable. My father might have failed to live up to his own principles, but I was determined not to make the same mistake. I also started to understand that my relationship with Linda Morrison would affect how I remembered my father for the rest of my life. If I never confronted her about their secret relationship, I would always wonder if Dad had truly loved me, or if I had just been an obligation he felt forced to maintain while his real emotional investment was with someone else. Did he talk about me to Linda? Did he ever express guilt about keeping their relationship secret from me? Did he make plans for a future where I would eventually meet her and accept her as part of his life? These questions were eating me alive, and I knew that living with uncertainty would be worse than living with painful truths. There was also the practical reality that Linda had received the largest portion of Dad's estate while I was left with debts and obligations I never knew existed. Even if I couldn't change the legal documents he had signed, I deserved to understand why he had made those choices and whether he had ever considered how they would affect me. Maybe Linda didn't even know that I existed, or maybe Dad had told her lies about our relationship to justify giving her priority in his will. I needed to know if this woman had actively participated in deceiving me, or if she was just as much a victim of my father's dishonesty as I was. The answers to these questions would determine whether I could ever forgive either of them for the situation I now found myself in. As I prepared to meet Linda face to face, I realized that this confrontation would ultimately determine what kind of daughter I had been and what kind of woman I was going to become. If my father had chosen someone else over me, I needed to know why, and I needed to hear it directly from the person who had been the beneficiary of that choice. I was tired of being the naive daughter who trusted everyone and questioned nothing, tired of being the kind of person who accepted whatever story she was told, without demanding proof or explanation. This meeting with Linda Morrison would be my chance to take control of my own narrative, to stop being a victim of other people's secrets, and start being someone who demanded honesty and respect. But I had no idea that what Linda would tell me about my father would be so much worse than anything I had already discovered, and that our conversation would force me to confront the deepest pain I had ever experienced in my life. The night before, I was supposed to meet Linda Morrison at a coffee shop downtown. I couldn't sleep because I was overwhelmed by a type of grief I had never experienced before. When Dad died from cancer, I had grieved for the loss of his physical presence, for all the conversations we would never have, and all the memories we would never make together. But this new grief was different and somehow more devastating. I was mourning the loss of my trust in him, the death of my belief that he was the honest and devoted father I had always thought he was. It felt like I was losing him all over again. But this time I was losing the good memories too, because every happy moment we had shared was now contaminated by the knowledge that he had been living a lie. If you've ever had to grieve not just for a person you lost, but for the version of that person you thought you knew, then you understand the unique pain I was experiencing. Have you ever felt like you needed to mourn your own innocence and naivety? I kept thinking about all the nights I had spent comforting myself with memories of Dad after he passed away, replaying conversations where he had told me how much I meant to him and how proud he was to be my father. Those memories had been my refuge during the darkest moments of grief, the proof that I had been deeply loved by someone who would always be with me in spirit. Now those same memories felt like lies, like elaborate performances he had put on to keep me from discovering his secret life with Linda. I wondered if he had ever felt genuine love for me, or if I had just been an obligation he maintained out of duty while his real emotional energy was invested in someone else. The thought that our entire relationship might have been artificial made me feel sick to my stomach. What made the pain even worse was the realization that I had been grieving alone while Linda Morrison had been dealing with the same loss, probably with much more support and validation than I had received. She had been his partner in life, his confidant, the person who knew all his secrets and shared his daily routines. When Dad was going through cancer treatments, she was probably the one holding his hand in the hospital, the one he turned to for comfort when he was scared about dying. Meanwhile, I had been relegated to the role of visiting daughter, someone who showed up for scheduled appointments, but wasn't trusted with the intimate details of his struggle. It felt like she had gotten to be his real family, while I was just playing a supporting role in his life. The betrayal felt even deeper, because Dad had always taught me that family relationships were the most important connections in life, that blood relationships should always come first before any other commitments. "Harper," he used to tell me, "friends will come and go, but family is forever, and you should never let anyone come between you and the people who share your DNA." Now I knew that he had been violating this principle for 8 years, choosing a romantic relationship over his relationship with his only child. He had taught me values that he didn't follow himself, and he had used those values to make me feel secure in his love while he was actually prioritizing someone else. The hypocrisy was almost more painful than the deception itself. As I finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, I realized that this grief was going to be with me for a long time, maybe forever, unlike the grief I had felt when Dad died, which had gradually lessened as time passed. This grief over losing my trust in him felt like it might actually get worse as I learned more details about his secret life. Every new piece of information would probably bring fresh waves of pain, fresh realizations about how thoroughly he had deceived me. But I also knew that I couldn't heal from this betrayal until I faced it completely, until I learned everything there was to know about Linda Morrison and her relationship with my father. The meeting I had scheduled for the next morning would be the beginning of a journey into the truth that would either destroy me completely or somehow set me free from the lies that had been shaping my life for so many years. Little did I know that Linda Morrison had been carrying her own burden of guilt and secrets, and that what she would reveal to me would change not only my understanding of my father, but also my understanding of what it means to be betrayed by someone who claims to love you. I arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early, my hands shaking as I ordered a cup of tea that I knew I wouldn't be able to drink. As I sat at a corner table watching people come and go, I kept rehearsing what I would say to Linda Morrison when she walked through that door. Part of me was still hoping she wouldn't show up, that I could avoid this confrontation and just pretend that none of this had ever happened. But a stronger part of me knew that this meeting was necessary for my own sanity and self-respect, that I couldn't move forward with my life until I looked this woman in the eye and demanded the truth about her relationship with my father. The decision to confront her wasn't just about getting answers. It was about choosing to be the kind of person who fights for herself instead of accepting whatever lies other people decide to tell her. If you've ever had to gather courage to face someone who participated in betraying you, please subscribe and like this video, because you'll understand exactly why this moment was so crucial for my healing process. Have you ever had to choose between your comfort and your dignity? When Linda Morrison walked into that coffee shop, I recognized her immediately, even though we had never met before. She looked exactly like the kind of woman my father would have been attracted to: elegant, confident, and about 10 years younger than he was. As she approached my table, I could see sadness in her eyes, but also something that looked like guilt or shame. "Harper," she said softly, "I'm so sorry we have to meet under these circumstances. Your father talked about you all the time, and I always hoped that someday we would meet in a different way." Her words hit me like a physical blow because they confirmed that Dad had been discussing me with her for years, while keeping her existence completely secret from me. I felt angry that she knew things about my life, while I knew nothing about hers. Angry that she had been part of conversations about my future while I was excluded from discussions about hers. Linda sat down across from me and immediately started apologizing for the phone call she had made, explaining that she had wrestled with whether to contact me for months after Dad's funeral. "Robert made me promise never to tell you about our relationship," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "He said that you were still dealing with your mother's death and that learning about us would only cause you more pain. But when I realized that you were about to meet with the lawyer without knowing the full truth about his estate, I couldn't stay silent anymore." I stared at her in disbelief, trying to process the fact that my father had specifically instructed his secret girlfriend to lie to me even after his death. The manipulation went so much deeper than I had realized. He had not only deceived me during his lifetime, but he had also arranged for that deception to continue even after he was gone. As Linda continued talking, I learned that she had been struggling with her own guilt about their secret relationship for years. She explained that Dad had promised her multiple times that he would eventually tell me about their life together, that he was just waiting for the right moment when I seemed emotionally ready to handle the news. But that moment never came, she said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Every time he was about to tell you, something would happen. You'd have a bad breakup, or work stress, or you'd mention missing your mother, and he would decide to wait a little longer." I realized that my father had been using my normal life struggles as excuses to avoid having difficult conversations, prioritizing his own comfort over my right to know the truth about his life. He had been protecting himself from potential conflict with me by keeping Linda a secret, even though that secret was preventing both of us from having honest relationships with him. The most painful revelation came when Linda told me that Dad had been planning to introduce us after he finished his cancer treatments. "He had this whole fantasy about the three of us becoming a family," she said, reaching across the table as if she wanted to touch my hand. "He thought that once he beat cancer, he would have a second chance at life, and he wanted that life to include both of us. He talked about family dinners, holidays together, maybe even walking me down the aisle if we decided to get married." I felt sick hearing about these plans that would never happen, plans that my father had made without ever asking if I would be interested in accepting Linda as part of my family. He had assumed that I would just go along with whatever arrangement he presented to me, that my love for him would be enough to make me accept the woman who had been stealing his attention from me for 8 years. But now that I was sitting across from Linda Morrison, looking into the eyes of the woman who had been my father's secret priority, I knew that the time for passive acceptance was over. It was time to tell her exactly how her presence in his life had affected mine. Looking at Linda Morrison across that coffee shop table, I took a deep breath and prepared to say things I had been rehearsing in my mind for days. This wasn't going to be a polite conversation between two people who had both loved the same man. This was going to be a confrontation where I finally expressed all the anger and pain that had been building up inside me since I learned about their secret relationship. I could see that Linda was expecting me to be understanding and sympathetic, maybe even grateful that she had called to warn me about the estate situation, but I was done protecting other people's feelings at the expense of my own. The time had come to tell her exactly what her 8-year relationship with my father had cost me, and I didn't care if the truth made her uncomfortable. If you've ever had to prepare yourself to say difficult truths to someone who hurt you, please subscribe and hit that like button because you know how hard it is to find the courage to speak up for yourself. Have you ever reached a point where being polite felt like betraying your own need for justice? I started by telling Linda that I didn't want her sympathy or her apologies. What I wanted was for her to understand the impact of her choices on my life. "You say that my father talked about me all the time," I said, my voice steady but cold. But while you were learning about my life through his stories, I was being completely excluded from knowing about yours. Do you have any idea what it feels like to discover that your father has been sharing intimate details about you with a complete stranger for 8 years? I could see the shock in her eyes as she realized that I wasn't going to play the role of the grieving daughter who just wanted to understand. I was there to hold her accountable for her part in deceiving me, and I wanted her to know that her decision to keep their relationship secret had real consequences for real people. Linda tried to interrupt me with more explanations about how Dad had made her promise to stay hidden, but I wasn't interested in hearing about promises between two people who had conspired to lie to me. You were an adult who made choices, I told her firmly. You chose to accept a relationship where the man you loved was ashamed to introduce you to his only daughter. You chose to let him spend 8 years lying to me, instead of insisting that he be honest about his life. And you chose to accept money and benefits from his estate, while his actual daughter was left with nothing but debts. I watched her face change as she realized that I knew about the life insurance policy and the financial arrangements Dad had made in her favor. The guilt in her expression told me that she had hoped I would never find out about those details. I explained to Linda that her presence in Dad's life had stolen something from me that could never be replaced. The last 8 years of having an honest relationship with my father. Every time he canceled plans with me to spend time with you, every time he seemed distracted during our conversations because he was thinking about you, every time he made excuses about why I couldn't visit his house, those were moments of my relationship with him that I can never get back, I said, feeling tears of anger start to form in my eyes. You got to share his daily life, his fears about cancer, his hopes for the future, while I was kept at arm's length and fed lies about why he was always too busy or too tired to spend time with his own daughter. I wanted her to understand that this wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about the theft of time and intimacy that should have been mine by right of being his child. The conversation was becoming more intense than I had expected, and I could see that Linda was starting to get defensive about her relationship with my father. She began trying to justify their secrecy by explaining how much Dad had loved me and how he had only been trying to protect me from additional stress during difficult times in my life. But I cut her off before she could finish making excuses for him. If he loved me so much, why did he choose you over me for 8 years? I asked, my voice getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. If family was supposed to come first, like he always taught me, why did he give you priority in his will while leaving me with debts I didn't even know existed? I could feel the eyes of other coffee shop customers turning toward our table, but I didn't care anymore about making a scene. This woman needed to hear exactly what her secret relationship had cost me, and I was finally ready to make her face the consequences of her choices. But what Linda said next would shock me even more than anything I had already discovered, because she was about to reveal that my father's deception went much deeper than even she had realized. Linda Morrison looked around the coffee shop nervously, then leaned forward and lowered her voice before dropping a bombshell that I never saw coming. Harper, there's something else you need to know about your father that I've been afraid to tell anyone, she said, her hands trembling as she spoke. Robert wasn't just keeping our relationship secret from you. He was keeping secrets from me, too. Secrets that I only discovered after he died. My heart started racing as I realized that the man who had already proven to be a master manipulator might have been deceiving both of us in ways that neither of us had understood. I felt a strange mixture of anger and curiosity as I waited for her to continue, knowing that whatever she was about to reveal would probably make everything even more complicated than it already was. Linda explained that after Dad's funeral, she had been going through his personal belongings when she discovered a hidden box in their bedroom closet that contained documents and photographs she had never seen before. Inside that box, I found letters from other women. Harper, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Letters that were dated during the time Robert and I were supposedly in an exclusive relationship. There were at least 3 different women writing to him, talking about romantic dinners, intimate moments, promises he had made to them about their future together. I stared at her in shock, trying to process the possibility that my father had not only been living a double life, but potentially a triple or quadruple life, juggling multiple relationships while keeping all of these women in the dark about each other. The revelation got even worse, as Linda continued to describe what she had found in that hidden box. She told me about bank statements showing regular payments to women whose names she didn't recognize, hotel receipts from times when he had told her he was traveling for business, and even jewelry receipts for expensive gifts that he had never given to her. One of the letters mentioned plans for a vacation to Hawaii that Robert had apparently promised to take with this other woman, a trip that was supposed to happen just 2 months before he was diagnosed with cancer, Linda said, tears streaming down her face. I realized that while I thought I was the most important person in his life, he was probably telling the same lies to multiple women, making the same promises to all of us that he clearly had no intention of keeping. As Linda spoke, I began to understand that my father's capacity for deception was far greater than either of us had imagined. He hadn't just been keeping one secret relationship from me. He had been maintaining an entire network of lies that affected multiple women who all believed they were special to him. I think your father was addicted to the thrill of living multiple lives, Linda said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. He got some kind of satisfaction from being able to convince different women that they were the love of his life, from being able to maintain separate relationships without any of us knowing about the others. We were all just characters in different stories he was telling himself about who he wanted to be. The image of my father that I had been trying to reconstruct since learning about Linda was crumbling even further, revealing a man who was not just a liar, but potentially a pathological manipulator who had hurt far more people than just his daughter. Linda's final revelation was the most devastating of all, because it explained why she had really called me in the first place. Harper, I didn't just call you because I felt guilty about keeping our relationship secret, she admitted, looking directly into my eyes. I called you because after discovering those other women, I realized that you and I might be the only people who actually cared about Robert for who he really was, not for the fantasy versions of himself that he presented to his other girlfriends. You loved him as your father, and I loved him despite his flaws. But those other women only knew the lies he told them. She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. I thought that maybe if we worked together, we could figure out how to honor the good parts of who he was while also holding him accountable for all the pain he caused. But now I'm wondering if there were any good parts left, or if everything about him was just an elaborate performance designed to get what he wanted from the people who trusted him. As I sat there listening to Linda's confession, I realized that my father's betrayal was so much deeper than I had ever imagined, and that both Linda and I had been victims of a man who had never learned how to love anyone without also deceiving them. Walking out of that coffee shop after my confrontation with Linda Morrison, I felt completely emotionally drained, but also strangely relieved to finally know the full truth about my father's character. The man I had spent my entire life trying to understand and emulate had turned out to be someone who was fundamentally incapable of honest relationships with anyone, including his own daughter. While this knowledge was devastating, it also freed me from the burden of trying to figure out what I had done wrong to deserve being excluded from his life. I hadn't been excluded because I was inadequate or unworthy. I had been excluded because Robert White was someone who compartmentalized every relationship in his life to avoid having to be fully authentic with anyone. The relief of understanding that his deception wasn't about my failures as a daughter was almost as powerful as the pain of learning about his betrayals. Linda and I had agreed to stay in touch as we both tried to process what we had learned about the man we had both loved and trusted. We discovered that we had more in common than either of us had expected. We were both women who had believed in someone who had never really existed, who had built our identities partly around our relationships with a person who had been performing a role rather than living authentically. Maybe Robert never learned how to be real with people because he was afraid that his true self wouldn't be good enough, Linda had suggested as we prepared to leave the coffee shop. While I wasn't ready to forgive him or make excuses for his behavior, I was beginning to understand that his deception might have come from his own deep insecurities rather than from any desire to specifically hurt me or the other women in his life. The financial reality of my situation was still challenging, but knowing the truth about my father's character had changed how I felt about the debts and obligations he had left behind. Instead of seeing them as a burden that proved he didn't love me enough to provide for my future, I now understood them as evidence of a chaotic life where he had been making promises to multiple people that he couldn't possibly keep. The debts weren't a reflection of his feelings about me. They were a reflection of his inability to live within his means while maintaining the lifestyle necessary to support multiple relationships. This new understanding didn't solve my financial problems, but it did eliminate the emotional pain of feeling like he had deliberately chosen to leave me with nothing while providing for Linda. I also began to realize that my father's deception had actually given me a valuable gift, though it had taken me a long time to recognize it. By keeping his true character hidden from me, he had protected me from learning to normalize dishonesty and manipulation in relationships. Unlike Linda and the other women who had enabled his lying by accepting secret relationships, I had been raised with clear expectations about honesty and integrity. Now that I knew the truth about him, I could choose to maintain those values in my own life while also being more alert to signs of deception in other people. My father had taught me what kind of person I didn't want to be, and what kind of treatment I should never accept from people who claimed to love me. As I drove home from that life-changing coffee shop meeting, I felt like I was finally beginning to heal from the betrayal that had been consuming me for weeks. The anger was still there, and probably always would be to some extent, but it was no longer the overwhelming emotion that dominated my thoughts every day. I was starting to feel grateful for Linda's courage in calling me, even though her revelations had been painful, because living with the truth was ultimately better than living with lies and confusion. I had learned that my father was not the man I had believed him to be, but I had also learned that I was stronger and more resilient than I had realized. The process of confronting his deception had forced me to develop my own sense of integrity and self-worth, qualities that would serve me well as I moved forward with my life. But there was still one more difficult conversation I needed to have, one that would determine whether I could truly put this betrayal behind me and start building a future based on honesty, rather than the comfortable illusions that had shaped my past. 6 months after my confrontation with Linda Morrison and the devastating discoveries about my father's multiple deceptions, I can honestly say that I'm grateful for every painful moment of that journey toward the truth. Learning that Robert White was not the man I thought he was turned out to be the most liberating experience of my adult life, because it freed me from trying to live up to the expectations of someone who had never actually practiced the values he preached to me. Instead of continuing to define myself as the daughter of an honest, hardworking man, I was finally able to start building my own identity based on my own principles and my own definition of integrity. The financial struggles that followed were real and difficult, but they also taught me that I was capable of supporting myself without relying on promises that other people might not keep. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after discovering that someone you trusted was living a lie, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button because you know exactly how empowering it can be to choose truth over comfortable illusions. Have you ever found strength you didn't know you had after going through a betrayal? I decided to use my experience as motivation to create the kind of honest, authentic life that my father had never been able to achieve for himself. Instead of letting his deception make me cynical about relationships and family, I chose to see it as a lesson about the importance of surrounding myself with people who value transparency and genuine connection. I started being more direct in my own relationships, asking harder questions, setting clearer boundaries, and refusing to accept vague explanations when I needed real answers. This new approach to relationships was initially uncomfortable because it required me to risk conflict and rejection, but it ultimately led me to build much deeper and more satisfying connections with the people who remained in my life after I started demanding honesty from them. The process of dealing with Dad's debts and settling his estate turned out to be one of the most educational experiences of my life, teaching me about financial responsibility and legal procedures that I never would have learned otherwise. Instead of seeing these challenges as punishments for his poor decisions, I chose to view them as opportunities to develop skills and knowledge that would serve me well in the future. I learned how to negotiate with creditors, how to read legal documents, how to create budgets and payment plans, and how to advocate for myself in situations where other people had more experience and power than I did. By the time I finished resolving all of his financial obligations, I felt like I had earned a degree in practical life skills that no university could have provided. One of the most surprising outcomes of my confrontation with Linda was that we became genuine friends, bonded by our shared experience of loving someone who had been incapable of loving us back honestly. We met regularly for coffee to process our feelings about Robert, and to support each other through the complicated grief of mourning someone while also being angry at them. Linda taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting or excusing someone's behavior. It means choosing not to let their failures define your future happiness. Together, we created a support system that helped both of us heal from the unique pain of being deceived by someone who claimed to love us more than anyone else in the world. Looking back on this entire experience, I realized that my father's betrayal was actually a gift that taught me lessons I never could have learned any other way. I learned that my worth as a person is not dependent on how other people treat me, that my happiness cannot be built on assumptions about other people's character, and that the only relationships worth maintaining are those based on mutual honesty and respect. I discovered that I am much stronger and more resilient than I ever knew, capable of surviving devastating disappointments and rebuilding my life according to my own values, rather than other people's expectations. Most importantly, I learned that the truth really does set you free, even when that truth is painful, because living with lies and illusions ultimately causes more suffering than facing reality with courage and determination. The Harper White who emerged from this experience is someone I'm proud to be, someone who demands honesty from herself and others, someone who has learned that authentic relationships are worth fighting for even when the fight is difficult and scary. As I finish telling you this story about betrayal, deception, and ultimately finding the strength to demand truth in my relationships, I want you to know that whatever betrayal you might be dealing with in your own life, you have the power to survive it and emerge stronger than you were before. The pain of discovering that someone you trusted has been lying to you is unlike any other kind of suffering, but it's also an opportunity to develop the kind of inner strength and self-respect that can never be taken away from you by anyone else's actions. You don't have to accept being lied to, manipulated, or excluded from important decisions that affect your life, no matter how much you love the person who is doing these things to you. The courage to confront difficult truths and demand honest treatment is already inside you. You just have to choose to use it, even when using it feels scary or uncomfortable. I know that some of you watching this video are probably dealing with similar situations, trying to decide whether to confront someone who has betrayed your trust, or whether to just accept the situation and try to move on without making waves. From my own experience, I can tell you that choosing temporary peace over truth will ultimately cause you more pain than choosing the difficult path of demanding honesty and accountability. The conversations you're avoiding, the questions you're not asking, the boundaries you're not setting. These acts of avoidance might feel like they're protecting you from conflict, but they're actually protecting other people from the consequences of their dishonest behavior while leaving you to carry the burden of their deception. You deserve relationships where you don't have to wonder if people are telling you the truth, where you don't have to worry about what secrets are being kept from you, where you don't have to question whether the love and respect you're receiving is genuine. You deserve to be with people who choose you consistently, not just when it's convenient for them, not just when they don't have better options, not just when keeping you happy serves their own interests. The people who truly deserve to be in your life will welcome your questions, respect your need for honesty, and prove their commitment to you through their actions rather than just their words. If my story has resonated with you, if you've seen yourself in my struggles with betrayal and the difficult journey toward truth and healing, then I want to invite you to continue this conversation in the comments below. Tell me about your own experiences with betrayal, about the courage you found to confront difficult situations, about the lessons you learned from people who disappointed you. Share your story not just for your own healing, but to help other people who are still struggling with similar situations and need to know that they're not alone in their pain. Your willingness to be vulnerable about your own experiences might be exactly what someone else needs to find the strength to demand better treatment from the people in their lives. And if this video has helped you in any way, if hearing about my journey has given you perspective on your own situation or courage to make difficult decisions, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss future stories about overcoming betrayal, building authentic relationships, and finding strength in the most challenging moments of life. Hit that like button to let me know that this content is valuable to you, and share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing that they have the power to survive and thrive after being betrayed by someone they trusted. Remember, your story isn't over just because someone else chose to write lies into their chapter of your life. You still get to decide how your story ends, and you have the power to make sure it ends with truth, strength, and the kind of relationships that honor who you really are. As I sit here today, exactly 1 year after that life-changing phone call from Linda Morrison, I can honestly say that discovering my father's betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it was also the most painful experience of my life. The Harper White who walked into that lawyer's office expecting to inherit her father's fortune was naive, trusting, and willing to accept whatever story she was told without asking difficult questions. The Harper White who exists today is someone who demands honesty, who sets boundaries, who refuses to be anyone's secret or second choice, and who has learned that her worth is not determined by how other people choose to treat her. If you've made it this far in my story, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button, because you understand that sometimes the most devastating experiences can become the foundation for the strongest, most authentic version of yourself. Have you ever discovered that what felt like the worst thing that could happen to you was actually preparing you for the best version of your life? The financial struggles that followed my father's death taught me lessons about independence and resilience that I never could have learned if I had simply inherited his money and continued living the comfortable but unexamined life I had been leading before. Having to pay off his debts, navigate legal complications, and build my own financial security from scratch showed me that I was capable of much more than I had ever realized. I learned to budget, to negotiate, to advocate for myself in difficult situations, and to find creative solutions to problems that initially seemed impossible to solve. More importantly, I learned that my sense of security and self-worth couldn't be dependent on other people's promises or financial support, because the only person I could truly count on was myself. My friendship with Linda Morrison has become one of the most valuable relationships in my life, proving that sometimes the people who hurt us can also become the people who help us heal if we're willing to approach them with honesty and courage. Together, we've processed our complex feelings about Robert White, supporting each other through the grief of loving someone who was incapable of loving us back honestly. We've also held each other accountable for building healthier relationships going forward, challenging each other when we notice patterns of accepting less than we deserve from other people. Our friendship has taught me that healing from betrayal doesn't have to be a solitary journey, and that finding someone who truly understands your experience can be more therapeutic than years of trying to process the pain alone. The most important lesson I've learned from this entire experience is that the truth really will set you free, even when that truth is devastating and changes everything you thought you knew about your life. Living with lies and illusions might feel safer in the short term, but it ultimately prevents you from building authentic relationships and developing genuine self-confidence. When you demand honesty from the people in your life, you might lose some relationships that were based on deception or convenience, but you'll also create space for connections that are based on mutual respect and genuine love. The pain of losing people who weren't really there for you anyway is temporary, but the peace of knowing that your remaining relationships are built on truth is permanent. To everyone who has listened to my story about betrayal, confrontation, and ultimately finding strength in the darkest moments of life, I want you to know that you have the power to write your own ending, no matter what other people have done to complicate your story. You don't have to accept being lied to, manipulated, or excluded from your own life just because confronting these situations feels difficult or scary. The courage to demand truth and respect is already inside you, waiting for you to choose to use it, even when using it requires you to risk conflict or loss. Your story doesn't end with someone else's betrayal. It begins with your decision to choose authenticity over comfort, truth over illusion, and self-respect over the approval of people who don't deserve your trust. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and remember that every ending can become a new beginning if you're brave enough to write your own next chapter based on your own values, rather than other people's lies.